He is here. Hallelujah. He is here. Amen. He is here. Holy, holy. I will bless his name again. He is here. Listen closely. Hear him calling out your name. He is here. You can touch him. You will never be the same. He is here. Hallelujah. He is here. Amen. He is here. Holy, holy. I will bless his name again. He is here. Listen closely. Hear him calling out your name. He is here. You can touch him. You will never be the same. One more time. He is here. Hallelujah. He is here. Amen. He is here. Holy, holy. I will bless his name again. He is here. Listen closely. Hear him calling out your name. He is here. You can touch him. You will never be the same. Amen. Thank you.
Now that's practice for Sunday, if you can be here for Sunday, because somebody I know is going to do that for special, and you could sing along.
There are verses too. You just need the chorus.
We are going to launch in, and so we may end up a little bit shorter than a typical Wednesday night because we don't have a large group. On the other hand, you might get really talkative, and we could have all kinds of things going on tonight. So we have been studying for some time, and not everybody's been involved. We drafted Cindy last time, and so she had to endure what we did. Then we found out later that the microphone quit halfway through what we were doing because we had microphone wireless that I was on. So if you notice, we're all on wired microphones today. And so we've been talking about living by the book. Just so you know, Howard Hendricks, the late Howard Hendricks now, he was living the first time we did this years ago, and wrote Living by the Book. He did a video series, in fact, and we've been sort of tracking along the kind of series that he did, except I find that if I play a video for you, everybody goes to sleep. And so I'm not saying you don't go to sleep when I'm talking, but you especially go to sleep if I'm playing the video. So what we're going to do is you can always adjust anything that you need up there. We have been making our way through a 3-step procedure for how you study the Bible. And if you understand how to go about Bible study, it really helps tremendously because what we said in the beginning was we needed to take the first step is observation. That is, what do I see? If I can really find out what is in the Bible to look at, that's going to help me, because the better my observations, the better my interpretations. And interpretation is the second step, and that is to find out what does it mean. I can't possibly say what it means if I don't know what it said. And so that is one of the problems that many of us have observed. with Bible study classes over the years is somebody will mention a passage and they'll say, well, what do you think that means? And then they go all the way around the room and everybody has a different idea about what it means. And you think, well, how are we going to break the tie? You got to study it first and then you say what it means. So first you make observations. We are still in the observation phase. And then when we get done with interpretation, because often that was a problem too, people say, well, here's what I think, here's what I think. And then you get done with the whole thing and then you say, okay, next passage. And we never found out what we should do about it. And so we have to get to application. How does it work? What should I be doing as a result of what it was that I read and studied and found out the true meaning? So you can still find copies of that different places, and it's a good study guide and would go through all the kinds of material that we're covering in here. You just don't get the group dynamic, and so this is fun. So last time we looked at one verse. We were in Acts chapter 1 and verse 8. And of course, we didn't stay in verse 8. It caused us to go back to the beginning of the chapter. And then we had to think about the whole rest of the book in context because of what verse 8 said. So today, we're going to go all the way back to Nehemiah, and we're going to look at a paragraph. And what you find out as you study the Bible is that a paragraph is sort of like your basic unit of study. If you read a verse or a sentence, you might get all kinds of things, but you're really not going to grasp the context of anything unless you can grab an entire paragraph. Paragraph can't stand on its own necessarily, but at least it gives you a complete unit of thought. And it may reference things that come before, and it may point you to things that come after. But so today, if you have a Bible, and I hope you do, if not, there are Bibles around the room. And so Nehemiah chapter 1, beginning in verse 4, and we will go all the way down through verse 11. And I'm looking at this in the New King James. I'm actually still reading through the CSB, and which I'm liking, but I put this in New King James, which is what I normally preach from. So last time, only a verse. This time, we have to sort of take a bigger look at things because we have a big passage. And the first thing that you notice here in verse 4, as we introduce this paragraph, it says, so it was. You may have King James or something that says, and when I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for many days. I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. So when we read this first real clause, when it says, when I heard these words, what does that make you begin to think? What should I be doing as a result of reading when I heard these words? If I just jumped into this like we did today, what's the first thing that should come to mind?
We need to figure out what those words were.
Okay, what words? And if you just had to guess, considering we're in chapter 1 and verse 4, there's not much Nehemiah that comes before this point. Where do you think I should go back to as a starting place? Verse 3. At least verse 3. We're so close to the beginning. Why don't we go all the way back to verse 1, right? And so we have a connection here. It says, so it was when I heard these words. So what we want to know is, what words are we talking about? And so that's what we see here. We know that somebody, whoever it is who's speaking, it has heard something. And so we want to find out something about what it was that they heard. If I go all the way back to verse 1, I am, as it turns out, past the point of finding out what those words are, or maybe maybe we need to ask a question first. It says in verse 1, the words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. Do you think these are the words that he's talking about? If he says, when I heard these words. Now, these are the words of Nehemiah, right? And so Nehemiah heard some words. I assume he wasn't just talking to himself when he heard those words. He heard some other words, and we'll see them. But let's not skip past verse 1 before we get into this. So immediately, I see something about the nature of this book. These are the words of Nehemiah. And so who is the author of this book? What do we know already? He's Nehemiah. And that is an interesting statement all by itself, because there's more than one Nehemiah in the Bible. And so which Nehemiah is this one? He's the son of Hakaliah. So I know the family that he came from, and also as we get a little further into this, I'll have some picture of the time frame, and so I can separate him from other Nehemiah. So here we have the words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, and he begins to tell us some things. It came to pass in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan, the citadel or palace you may have, that Hanani, one of my brethren, came with men from Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped, who had survived the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. So immediately he starts off, and let's see, I've got pastor here, and I've got 3 people who spent last year teaching as substitute teachers, and then I have a former homeschooling mother. So I'm going to use fancy terms right now. So we have 3 prepositional phrases. In other words, we have 3 descriptions of something that was taking place here. And it says, the first one is, I'm in the month of Kislev. Now, what would we say if we were thinking about those journalistic questions? Who, what, when, where, why, wherefore, that kind of thing. What kind of a question is this answering if I say it's in the month of Kislev? Yeah, the time, right? It's answering the when question. And in particular, it's telling me what month it is. And of course, all of us are extremely familiar with the month of Kislev, right? Well, this is where you might want to actually look in a dictionary or, reference Bible or something like that and find out when this is. So it's not as if you're going to learn everything just by reading the words. There is some history and culture and so forth. And so the month of Kislev would be like what we think of November and bleeding into December. And so it's winter time, assuming that we're someplace sort of like this. And so it's not just in the month of Kislev, he says, in the 20th year. And what would that make you want to ask immediately?
The 20th year of what?
Okay, the 20th year since the creation of mankind, the 20th year since the universe was created, or the 20th year of Nehemiah. He was 20 years old. What does it mean? We don't get the answer in this paragraph, but extra bonus points. Who can tell me where we do find the answer? If you've got a Bible open. I won't make you search around, but if you were to, well, that'd be one way. Or you could actually read the verse that comes after our passage, and you would be in chapter 2. And what would you find there?
That it was during the reign of King Artaxerxes.
Okay, King Artaxerxes. Anybody know what kingdom he was the king of?
Wasn't he Persia?
Persia. So This is a world empire, the Persian kingdom, and it's in his 20th year, the 20th year of his reign. That's not going to be a huge issue as we're trying to interpret this passage, but it is important to know he's been king for a while. And so he is very powerful. He's got a firm hold on things. And so it's the month of Kislev, the 20th year, and they tell us something about the time. And then we see that they're at Shushan, the citadel or the palace. Now, anybody know anything about the palace, Shushan? This is where you would probably want to consult a reference as well. It's not as if we're going to read the word Shushan and immediately we're going to be able to discern what this is all about. But it turns out there are two palaces, and one of them is Shushan. It's the winter palace. So all this is beginning to make sense. It's the winter palace, and they're in the winter palace. And this is a fantastic place. It's the opulence, the size of it. It's like 5,000 acres worth of property. And so it's a very fancy place. It's the kind of place that you hole up and you don't run out of, nice things to look at and do over the winter months. And so here, Nehemiah is in this place. Artaxerxes is the king. So then something happens. What is it that happens there in verse 2? Yeah, a man who's from Judah, and of course we could find out as we made our way through, Nehemiah is Jewish, and so someone comes from Judah, and in particular from Jerusalem, which was the capital city there, and had been destroyed because of their sin, really. But so he gets a report, and as we think about this, let's begin to put together maybe a way to think about these things. So he has an opportunity to talk to somebody from Jerusalem or who's been to Jerusalem, and what's immediately the first thing that he wants to know about?
He wants to know about the Jews who had escaped and about the status of Jerusalem.
So his first question, he's asking about the Jews. And who are the Jews to Nehemiah? Yeah, his family, his people. Even though he's a captive and he's serving in this foreign king's, palace, we haven't talked about who he is there yet, but those are his people. He wants to know how his people are doing. And then the other question that he has, and the order is important, he wants to know what's going on back home. And so he asks these questions. And then, I don't have it on a slide up here, but if you look in verse 3, what do you find out? What does he say about the people?
The ones who were survivors are in trouble and disgrace.
Yes, great affliction and reproach, one passage puts it. And so the people are in trouble. They're having a rough time. And then what about so the question is put in two parts. How are my people? How is the home place? And the answer comes in the same kind of order. The people are afflicted and in reproach, and how is the place doing?
The wall of Jerusalem had been broken down and the gates had been burned.
Okay, so it's not doing well at all. And so this is an important thing to think about. We just recently, a few months ago, shortly before we went off the air, we had a little icy spell one morning, and Freddie went off the road on the C Highway and ended up in a tree. And so he calls home amazingly, we had cell reception to be able to call out. And so he gets Lydia on the phone, and what does she say? What? You wrecked that car? I can't believe that you would destroy our property like that. Who thinks that that was her response? What did she ask you, Freddie?
Are you okay?
So that's the part that's the most important part. Now, it's not the only important part because, as it turns out, if the car, for instance, was catching on fire, and exploding, then you might not stay okay. And so it is important to ask about the place as well. But the same kind of thing's going on with Nehemiah. He asks about the people. The people are having a rough time. And then he asks about the place and finds out, well, part of the reason that they're having a rough time is the walls are broken down, so they're defenseless, and the gates have been burned with fire. And so anybody, marauding bands, opposing peoples could come in and attack them. And so all of this is important, but the very form of the question and the order of the question and then the order of the answer given back is important, and it tells us something about them. So now that we've established what the story is, we're back to verse 4. And he says, so it was when I heard these words, and several things took place. And so we're going to put them in sort of, I would think maybe 3 categories. What's the very first thing that he says took place? And don't get tricked by my yellow marks up there. What did he do? He sat down. And so if we were going to put this in a category, would you say sitting down is a spiritual response? It's a physical response. And so there's a physical response that takes place, and he sits down, and that physical response is probably tied also to a spiritual response and also to another kind of response. And he says the second thing that took place, which is a two-pronged step, he says, I wept and mourned for many days. So what kind of a response is this that he's having? If we were going to put it in a category, it's not a spiritual response necessarily. There is a physical element, but he's having a what?
Emotional.
He's having an emotional response. He is being affected by this news. And so if we were just to try and grab things and put them in categories so we can get a handle, we got to have some way to get a hold of this passage. And so and that leads to fasting and praying before the God of heaven. So what kind of a response is that? Spiritual response. So he's being affected on all sides, isn't he? It's an emotional response that has caused him to have a physical response to it as he sits down, and then also to react to this emotional situation in his physical state of sitting down. He decides he's going to have a spiritual response of fasting and praying before the God of heaven. So now we've got some pieces that we can begin to put together. If we wanted to call what took place when his friend Hannah and I came, we would say that was sort of like the report. And preachers, we like to come up with things to help people remember. And when you're taking notes on something, you might want to come up with those kinds of devices as well. So if that's the report, then Nehemiah's actions, these 3 phases of actions, we could call them the
Response.
The response. You can tell that she's had to listen to me preach for several years. So that's good. He's fasting and praying, and then we get to the meat of what it is that he's praying. It begins in verse 5, and he says, I pray, Lord, God of heaven, O great and awesome God, you who keep your covenant and mercy with those who love you and observe your commandments. If we just looked at that beginning of that verse and we started thinking about what it is that he's saying, how would we describe that? I mean, what part of the prayer process really is that? It's the praise or the adoration. We've taught that many times. The Acts plan or the Pax plan or whatever it is. Why do we preach that that's the way we ought to do it? Well, what we've said many times is you want to learn how to pray? Good way to learn how to pray is to observe the prayers that we see in the Bible. And so here's an example where Nehemiah sits down and the first thing he does, he starts saying, Lord God of heaven, who is it that I'm talking to? I'm talking to the Lord God of heaven. And he's saying, what kind of a God is he? He's great and awesome. And he's saying, you're the kind of God who keeps his covenant and his mercy with those who love you and observe your commandments. And so he's saying, this is the kind of God that I'm speaking to. And that's an important thing. I like what Howard Hendricks said. You get ready to go to the grocery store, or you're making out your tithe check or whatever it is. One of the first things that you should probably get in the habit of doing, you should look in the checkbook if you're going to write a check and find out how much is in there. So that's what he's doing. He's saying, let me take a look at what kind of a God I have so that now when I get ready to make a withdrawal, I'll know what I can do. And so that's what he's looking at here. He's saying, this is the kind of God I have. And this is how much I have in the bank. I have a great God, an awesome God, the God of heaven, the one who keeps his covenant, and a merciful God. And so immediately when he starts thinking about who this God is, I don't know if you remember the Acts plan or the Pax plan, but what's the first thing that happens after you begin to think about who God is? Because Nehemiah does that here as well. Verse 6 and verse 7. He says, please let your ear be attentive and your eyes open, that you may hear the prayer of your servant, which I pray before you now, day and night, for the children of Israel, your servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel. When you start looking at God and you get a real good picture of who he is, what do we begin to look like in comparison?
We look pretty small, insignificant. He is great and awesome. Small
and insignificant, and also he's a holy God, and we are not holy, except by virtue of the fact that Jesus died for us and clothes us with his righteousness. So he's looking at God and he's checking out who it is, and it's interesting that he says immediately, for the children of Israel, your servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we've sinned against you. Both my father's house and I have sinned. So it's a confession. And he's confessing in particular the sins of all of Israel. I know Freddie didn't get to enjoy this particular part of growing up, but I did, because there were 4 of us in my family. 4 kids. And so the first thing would happen if something got broken or somebody did something wrong, whose sins are you going to confess? Yeah, of course. Steve did it, or Lisa did it, or Fred did it. I'm not going to say I did it. And so But you see that Nehemiah understands the score here, and he says, I'm confessing the sins of the children of Israel, which we, and I'm including myself, he says, we have sinned against you. He's not like watering it down and saying it as if I wasn't a part of it. He says, both my father's house and I. It's not like every other family in Israel did something wrong and my family was immune to all that. He says, yes, my family was a part of it, and in fact, I'm a part of it. And so he's confessing his sins. He knows that those sins may have had a part in bringing down Jerusalem. And in fact, if you read through the Old Testament, you find out that that's exactly what happened. So he lays it on. He says, we've acted very corruptly, verse 7, against you. Have not kept the commandments. He's getting specific about these things. The statutes nor the ordinance which you've commanded your servant Moses. In other words, we knew what we were supposed to be doing, and we just didn't do it. And you told us what could happen if that happened. And in verse 8, he gets into it and is thinking about what was promised, what God promised if they did these things. And so we have this illustration that we could use as sort of, if you think about what happened over in Isaiah chapter 6, most people are familiar with when in the year that King Uzziah died. And so Isaiah says he went to the temple and he saw the Lord high and lifted up. And he saw those seraphim and they were crying out, holy, holy, holy. And what was the very first thing that Isaiah thought as he was looking at this scene? Oh, how good it is that the Lord gets to visit with me today, because I am so wonderful. Is that what Isaiah was thinking? Or was he saying, woe is me, for I am undone? And he began to think in the same kind of way. My people, I live among a people of unclean lips, and I'm part of that problem. And so he thought, I'm just going to be vaporized here. I'm going to be gone, because I've seen the holy God, and I suddenly am so aware of how unholy I am. So that's what happens here. And he says, listen, in verse 8, I think we're getting into, if we thought about the adoration or the praise that takes place at first, and then we get into the confession. So now we're into what most people think of as prayer, which is the petition or the supplication part, where we're actually asking for something. But even here, he's sort of weighing what's going on here. And he says, the focus here, which we would want to do when we pray, is we're focusing on the promises of God. He says, here's what you commanded. Here's what you said you would do. And so we look at how many times that he says something personal like that. He says, you know, you commanded these things, your servant Moses. If you are unfaithful, speaking to us, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though some of you were cast out to the furthest part of the heavens, yet I will gather them from there and bring them to the place which I've chosen as a dwelling for my name. And what's going on right now? They've been scattered, and their place has been taken away. And he says, I'm looking back in the Old Testament, and I'm seeing where God promised that if we would turn from our sins and we would come back to him, he would gather us all and bring us back. And we could see Judah rise again. We could see Jerusalem rise again. And so that's a pretty exciting thing to think about. He's not in a position where there's any way to actually see this take place in his life. There's nothing like that going on. He's working in the palace of this world power king, and they own everything, and back home is just in shambles. But he sees that God has promised these things, and he already said he's a great and awesome God, and he's a God of mercy, and he's promised these things, and they're written down in black and white. And so he says, now these are your servants and your people, whom you've redeemed by your great power. In other words, you chose us, and you gave these promises to us by your great power. We were nothing when you did all this for us, when you brought us out of Egypt and so forth. It was by your strong hand. It wasn't because of anything that we did. If you went back in Deuteronomy and read, he would say, don't get the idea that it was because you were stronger than other nations, because you weren't. Or you were more numerous than other nations, because you weren't. And don't get the idea that it was because you were somehow more faithful or noble or holy or any of those things, because he says you weren't. I got 40 years in the desert to prove that. That's what Moses says in Deuteronomy at the conclusion of that 40 years. And so he says, we're just your servants, and you've done these things. So he's seen God, he's admitted his sin, he's ready to lift up his petitions, and now he's locking in. How does he know that God might be willing to answer these particular requests? Because he found them in the Bible. We go asking, oh Lord, I'm sure someplace in the Bible you promised that we could all have a brand new Mercedes-Benz or whatever it is. Well, I'm sorry, but there's nothing in the Bible like that. But for the Jews who are in captivity because of their sin, yes, there's a passage that says, if we would come back to you, we could be brought back home again, even though we were in a terrible situation. So look at the pattern. And we've seen it in other passages. If you read Daniel and so forth, you'd see here's the adoration and the praise, and then comes the confession, and then finally we offer up the supplications. But that supplication needs still to be based on the Bible. It needs to be based on what God has already promised to us. And then it almost seems like an afterthought here. He says at the end of verse 11, for I was the king's cupbearer. Now that's an interesting thing to sort of tack on at the end. That's the first time we learned who Nehemiah is. He's a cupbearer. And you say, what's a cupbearer? He's not just sort of like a guy who makes sure to carry the cup around in case Artaxerxes gets thirsty and needs somebody to hand it to him. He's a trusted official. In some ways, sometimes he gets compared to almost a prime minister type of position. You can tell in the dialogue that takes place later in the book, he's a guy that the king leans on for information. He's a guy who the king trusts. And of course, you know, in this day, if you think about what was going on, there was always some plot, big power like King Artaxerxes. Somebody wants to overthrow him. Somebody's always coming along and wants to do something about it. Just recently read through the book of Esther, and you find out that a couple of guys decided that they were going to do something to overthrow the king. And so what happens? Mordecai hears about the plot, and he makes sure to have Esther go tell the king what was going to happen. And then he investigates, finds out sure enough they were plotting to kill him, and has those guys killed. And later on, Mordecai is remembered because of the good deed he did in protecting the king. That's who the cupbearer is. He's the guy who has the king's ear all the time. He's close to him. Yes, he is supposed to make sure that the food that's brought to the king, a popular way to kill people back then was slip some poison in and that kind of thing. So yes, that is part of his duty, but it's much bigger than that. And so naturally, if your cupbearer all of a sudden looks very distraught and he's spending days weeping and mourning and fasting and praying, what kind of effect is that going to have on the king? Is he going to think, oh, how wonderful. I like it when my subjects cower before me and that kind of thing.
He's probably worried that he's going to be under attack of some kind.
Yeah, he's like maybe Nehemiah knows something and is afraid to tell me or something like that. And so he wants to keep Nehemiah happy because finding somebody you can trust in a situation like that, if you're the richest guy on the planet and you've got enemies everywhere, you finally find somebody you can trust. You don't want to have to go hunting for another one. You would like to keep him happy. And so that's what happens. He's got his own expense account. He's been placed in this position of cupbearer, and that's going to have an impact on the whole rest of the book. The question is, what is it that God has done for us? Where has he put us? It might be a substitute teacher in a classroom, or you might actually be working with food and bringing it to people. And, so God has placed us in particular areas and given us a particular circle of influence so that he can use us in that particular place. Nobody else is in the same place and in the same way. And so that's what's happening here. Nehemiah is in a place where he can do really huge things for his people because he's got the ear of the king of the world, basically. And so that's what we learn here. So there are 3 tasks that we need to do as we begin to put all these things together. The first is we just read it. We have to read it and figure out what the words are, what they're saying. We read it over and over. We let it become clear. Let it sink into us. And everything that we've talked about in the world of observation for the last, whatever it's been, 9-10 weeks. Then we need to record something. This is often where people just drop the ball completely. If we think as we read that I got it all figured out, we will find very quickly, if we try and jot down a few notes, whether what we think in our head really makes sense or not. Sometimes I'll have people say, must be terrible to have all those notes and things when you preach. And I think to myself, the reason I have notes is so that I eventually come to a stopping place. Because if you just turn me loose to have random thoughts from now until I get tired of having random thoughts, there'll be no end. And sometimes when we think we have something clear in our head, we kind of think that way, and we start putting it down on paper, we'll find out where the holes are. And that's when we begin to understand. We start ruling out these possibilities and ruling in these other possibilities. So we record something. Many people are afraid of this step because they think, well, I'm not good at this. And, I'm not seminary trained, or I'm not whatever it is. But here's the thing. Everybody who has ever existed on the face of the planet throughout all of time, with the exception of Jesus, has started the same place. We start with nothing, and then we start adding things in. The difference for some is they got over themselves and started writing some things down until it became clear. And then some of them end up writing books and, becoming good at these things. So there has to be something, and if we can summarize it and put it in some nice terms and sort of make it so we have a handle, that's helpful. And then we need to step back and meditate on it. We talked about having a spiritual cud to chew on. We reflect. So we read it, we record it, we reflect upon it. This is a passage about prayer. And so I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here, but if it says it's a passage about prayer and we see that Nehemiah is spending his time up front in adoration and praise, and then he gets into confession of his own sins as he sees what kind of a God he's praying to, and then he finally lifts up his petitions, but not just any petitions. He's lifting up petitions that have to do with the promises that God has given to him, when now all of a sudden we've got a model to follow. We've got some idea where to start. And so as we reflect upon these things and have recorded it and read it and got it sort of down in some kind of order, now we start asking the question, well, how am I doing in all of this? Is this the technique I've been using, or have I just sort of been throwing things haphazard together? This is telling me how I should pray, or showing me how I should pray. How am I doing? You might even want to read the rest of the book and find out God answered Nehemiah's prayer, and answered it in a huge way. And so if I'm not, then now what should I do about it? So we're leaking into the interpretation and the application part, but that's the whole idea, isn't it? That we make good observations. That way the interpretation and the application just sort of fall out because we made good observations. So that's where we are, and not going to try and get into anything extra this evening. I feel like we covered some ground, and I'm 10 minutes early.